Night settles over the old valley near Alpena, where the hills still remember the winter of 1859. Folks say a woman was judged by shadows more than truth, and one question lingers even now. What truly happened on the night the Ozarks held their own quiet witch trial? Some claim the echoes of that verdict have never fully faded away. Welcome, friends of these old hills. Tell me where you are watching from tonight, and when these stories find you. If our paths meet true, consider joining our growing archive. The hills around early Alpena were quieter in those years before the war, quieter in a way that feels almost unnatural to us now. Roads were little more than paths beaten into the earth by wagon wheels and hooves, worn smooth in some places and left jagged in others, and the forest pressed close enough that a traveler often felt watched. These slopes, carved by streams older than memory, held families who had drifted in from Tennessee, from Kentucky, from the Carolinas and Virginia, carrying with them old country sayings and the hard lessons of frontier life. Their cabins sat far apart, each with its own patch of corn, its own smokehouse, its own small world of fear and hope. In that time, before Alpenas was officially a town, before a railway split the ridgeline, and before the valley had even taken the shape we know today, life moved slowly, following the turn of seasons rather than the turn of clocks. People lived close enough to the land to feel its moods, and when the land darkened, they darkened with it. Illness passed through the hills on occasion, sometimes mild and sometimes cruel. A strange fever in the late 1850s had crept across scattered homesteads like a shiver. Some blamed the heavy summer air, others blamed bad water, and a few whispered darker causes. Livestock weakened without clear reason, whole gardens failed for no cause a farmer could point to, and nights seemed to carry a sharper edge. The Ozarks were not strangers to hardship. Storms and sickness had shaped the region long before any settlement. Yet these events carried a different weight, something that pressed down on the spirit more than the body. People began to watch one another with the smallest flicker of suspicion, asking in low tones who or what might be responsible for their misfortune. And though no one dared speak the word aloud at first, the old world idea of witchcraft was never entirely forgotten. In those hills, far from the printed sermons of larger towns, folk beliefs traveled from mouth to ear with ease. Many families kept charms tucked deep in drawers, or hung iron over the door, or burned certain herbs when a child grew pale. Few would admit openly to believing in witches, but most would not dismiss the thought completely. Ideas carried from the Scotch-Irish traditions were woven into daily life. Signs in the behavior of birds, omens in the sudden stillness of a dog, the meaning of a broken egg or a restless night. The Ozarks lived in a place between faith and folklore, and in that place, certainty was sometimes hard to find. When misfortune began to cluster around particular homesteads, the unspoken question started to take shape. Not shouted, not even spoken plainly, but breathed. Could someone among them be the cause? Tension gathered slowly, like mist pooling in a hollow. Families who once visited one another now kept to themselves. A neighbor who passed on horseback received only a stiff nod instead of a wave. Even the familiar sounds of the evening, the call of whip-poor-wills, the creak of trees settling for the night, seemed slightly off, as though the valley were holding its breath. The memory of Salem was distant in both geography and time, separated by nearly 2 centuries and many miles. Yet such stories had traveled through Bible readings, travelers' tales, and old fireside warnings. A place did not need to be Massachusetts to feel the cold shadow of those events. What we know from surviving accounts is limited, scattered across family papers, late recollections, and a few fading mentions in local records. Before Alpena was platted, before the name appeared on maps, this region was simply a collection of homesteads loosely tied together. When something strange happened, the community handled it themselves. Ministers came and went, courts were distant, and sheriffs sometimes lived farther away than a man could ride in a day. With that isolation came a sense of self-reliance, but also a sense of vulnerability. If something unexplainable struck, there were few avenues to make sense of it. Folks did what their grandparents had done, turning to old beliefs for guidance. Stories of hauntings and signs were common enough that they rarely caused alarm. But when these stories began to merge with real sickness and repeated misfortune, the boundary between folklore and lived danger blurred. A child falling ill might have been explained away. A cow going dry could have been blamed on poor forage. But both happening in the same household, followed by crops turning yellow, stirred talk. And when similar misfortunes followed a pattern around one particular ridge, people began to note who lived nearby, who had quarreled with whom, and who had been behaving differently than usual. Such thinking was not unusual for the era. Communities without doctors or dependable newspapers often sought explanations wherever they could. In these early days of the tension, the hills themselves seemed to listen. Travelers passing through would later recall a strange stillness, the kind that makes a man check over his shoulder without knowing why. Even the dogs were quieter, some said, sitting on cabin porches as though sensing something beyond human understanding. People walked with a wary air, locking shutters against a darkness they could not name. No one pointed a finger yet, but eyes lingered longer on certain doorways, and conversations ended quickly when a figure passed by. The deeper truth of those months is complicated. Many forces could have played a role: disease cycles, contaminated wells, harsh weather, or simple bad luck. Yet the people of the time lived within a web of spiritual and cultural beliefs strong enough to shape their understanding of every misfortune. And as often happens in isolated communities, when fear began to rise, it needed a shape to settle into. That shape was slowly forming, quietly, almost imperceptibly. As autumn deepened toward winter, the tension became harder to ignore. The air grew heavy, and the woods around the valley seemed to draw closer, as if listening. A few men held private talks in barns or along fence lines, speaking in low tones about what might be done if the troubles continued. Women gathered at springs or berry patches spoke in cautious phrases, treading around the heart of the matter without touching it directly. Children were told to stay close to home. Lanterns were kept lit later than usual. Somewhere in this slow tightening of fear, a whisper rose, quiet, uncertain, but sharp enough to catch. It passed from house to house like smoke. No one claimed to have started it, yet everyone seemed to hear it. That whisper named someone, a single woman living not far from the ridge where sickness had struck hardest. A woman known to be solitary, a woman whose habits did not fit neatly into the expectations of her neighbors, a woman whose name would soon be carried in frightened tones across the early Ozark hills. And on one cold evening, as the wind moved through the bare branches with a sound almost like speech, someone wondered aloud, barely above a breath, what if the cause of all this suffering was not natural at all? The question hung in the air, heavier than the wind itself. The question lingered in the cold evening air, drifting between cabins like a restless spirit looking for a place to settle. It did not need to be repeated. Fear rarely waits for permission. It settles into the spaces between words, into glances, into the silence shared between neighbors who no longer know quite what to believe. And in the weeks that followed that whispered doubt, the sickness spreading across the high ridges near the future site of Alpena took on a new meaning, one shaped not only by illness, but by suspicion. What had once been explained as bad water or a lingering summer fever now gathered a deeper darkness, as though the hills themselves had absorbed the anxieties of those who lived upon them. The strange illness that swept through the area in the late months of 1858 and into 1859 was never fully understood. Families recorded symptoms differently, and many records were lost as the years passed. But scattered accounts, preserved through family letters and regional memory, describe a fever that rose suddenly, leaving the afflicted weak and unsteady. Some suffered chills so severe the whole cabin shook. Others developed rashes or swelling around the joints. A few recovered within days, while others languished for weeks, unable to stand or keep down a meal. The illness did not move in a straight line across the hills, but leapt unpredictably. One homestead spared entirely, while another only a quarter-mile away fell into misery. Livestock, too, seemed touched by an unseen hand. Cows stopped giving milk without warning, chickens died in clusters, horses refused to eat. What frightened people most was not the sickness itself, but the way it seemed to follow patterns no one could map. It was in this atmosphere that rumors began to take shape, first quietly, then with a creeping boldness. Some elders remembered stories from their own childhoods, tales of unexplained illnesses blamed on curses, of hex signs carved into barn doors back east, of healers who could remove a curse if given the right ingredients. Most families dismissed such ideas when times were good, but hard seasons loosen the mind's grip on certainty. And this was indeed a hard season. Crops had been modest that year. Rain came in bursts that washed away more than they nourished. A few families had lost children to the fever, and grief has a way of seeking an answer, even when no answer exists. Into this fragile landscape, the old beliefs seeped like water into cracked soil. Some recalled an incident from a few years earlier, when a woman farther down the valley was quietly accused of bewitching a cow that had refused to fatten. Nothing came of it, but the memory resurfaced now, returning stronger than before. Others retold stories from distant kin in Tennessee, where an entire community had blamed a mysterious sickness on the jealousy of a widow living alone on the edge of town. When people are frightened, they begin connecting threads that were never meant to be woven together. A baby waking at night, a sudden gust of wind, a horse refusing to be bridled. Everything gained meaning it did not deserve. And always the whispered rumors circled back to the same single figure. The woman at the center of the growing suspicion lived near the ridge, where the sickness had been most severe. She had moved to the region some years before, after the death of her husband, and though not unfriendly, she was known to keep mostly to herself. Some said she talked too little, others said she talked too much. She walked long distances alone, gathering herbs and plants for reasons not everyone understood. To a more settled mind, such habits might have seemed benign, even admirable. But in a time when fear sharpened every observation, her quiet ways took on an air of mystery that made her vulnerable. Neighbors began noting her comings and goings. They remembered, with sudden clarity, the arguments she had once had with a family up the ridge about a boundary line unclear on early maps. They recalled, perhaps unfairly, that she had once refused a visit from a traveling preacher. A few even claimed to have seen her speaking softly to herself in the woods, though no one could say whether she had been praying or simply thinking. Yet in those mountains, where faith and memory run deep, the line between perception and suspicion grows thin when misfortune spreads. By December of 1858, the sickness had gained strength again. A child who had been showing improvement relapsed suddenly and died. A family lost a pig without a mark on it. Another homestead found their well water tasting strangely metallic for a day and then returning to normal. None of these events were related, at least not in any way that would make sense to a modern mind. But to people living in an era without reliable medical explanations, the patchwork of events formed a pattern that nudged their thoughts in a single direction. Even those who would have dismissed talk of witchcraft in calmer years now listened without interrupting. The fear spread in waves. Men discussed the matter in hushed tones while sharpening tools in their barns. Women exchanged uneasy glances while tending to laundry along the creek. Some swore they had seen shadows moving strangely near the suspected woman's cabin. Others claimed she had looked at them with an expression they could not forget. As stories multiplied, certainty grew, not because evidence supported it, but because repetition made it familiar. And familiarity in fearful times feels like truth. Newspaper records from the era are sparse. Alpena itself had not been founded, and the surrounding settlements were too small to support a regular press. But later recollections mention that the illness was severe enough to prompt talk of calling for a physician from as far away as Springfield or Fayetteville, though the expense and distance made such help unlikely. Without outside assistance, the community turned inward. When people look inward during times of crisis, they often seek answers in places that offer emotional comfort rather than factual clarity. Blame, even when misplaced, can feel like a form of control. As winter deepened further, the nights grew colder, and so did the conversations. A few families began leaving small offerings in front of their cabins, cornmeal, salt, or even pins, hoping to protect their homes from whatever force they believed was sweeping through the valley. Children were told not to wander near the ridge where the accused woman lived. Dogs bristled at passing strangers, but some swore they growled more intensely when facing that particular stretch of woodland. Whether this was imagination or instinct will never be known, yet stories like these added fuel to the growing fire. By the start of 1859, the idea that the sickness might have a supernatural cause was no longer confined to murmurs. It had entered the open, where fear thrives. Some argued that the community needed to pray more fervently. Others insisted that someone must confront the woman directly to break whatever influence she held over the valley. A few cautioned restraint, but in times of hardship, such voices are easily drowned out. And so the question spoken on that cold evening, what if the cause was not natural at all, returned again and again, gaining weight with every repetition. It settled into hearts that were already heavy, and soon it became less of a question and more of an assumption. Once a community reaches that point, events often move quickly, pushed along by a force that seems to come from beyond human will. One night, as frost gathered on cabin roofs and the moon cast a pale light across the ridge, someone claimed to hear a distant knocking sound, steady and hollow, echoing from the direction of the accused woman's homestead. No one could say what caused it or whether it existed at all. Yet the sound, real or imagined, planted itself in the valley's memory and nudged the community one step closer to action. That hollow knocking lingered in the minds of many. And it is from that faint, uncertain sound that the next part of the story begins. The hollow knocking, whether carried by wind or born from imagination, echoed in the minds of the families along the ridge long after the night had passed. It threaded its way through their thoughts as they tended fires in the early hours, as they hauled water from springs, as they sat in dim lamplight listening to the slow breath of sleeping children. Fear rarely arrives in a single moment. More often, it gathers in layers, thin as frost, until one morning a person wakes and finds their world entirely coated in it. By early 1859, the Ozark Ridge above the early settlement began to feel like a place suspended between dread and resolve, as though the people living there had reached a quiet but certain turning point. The sickness had not lifted. Livestock continued to weaken. A few families packed their belongings to stay temporarily with relatives in neighboring hollows. And through it all, the name of the solitary woman on the ridge was spoken more often, no longer in whispers, but in cautious, steady tones that suggested people had begun convincing themselves their fears were reasonable. Her cabin stood on a slight rise, backed by cedar and oak trees that remained dark even under winter's pale sky. Those who passed by her property, whether on horseback, wagon, or foot, said there was a stillness to the place that felt unnatural, not because of any visible sign, but because the quiet seemed too deep, as if the cabin itself were listening. Such descriptions often say more about the observer than the observed, but perception becomes truth in times of unease. Few people in the region had taken time to know the woman well. Grief had isolated her long before the sickness did. She had come to the ridge after losing her husband, and though she exchanged greetings with neighbors when necessary, she preferred solitude. Her habit of walking the woods alone, collecting herbs and roots, might have been harmless or even wise, but to frightened minds, it took on a darker significance. People remembered small details about her, details that had once been forgotten or dismissed, and reinterpreted them. A neighbor recalled how she had arrived late to a quilting gathering years earlier, her face pale and her hands shaking, and later wondered if that trembling was a sign of something hidden. Another remembered that she had given a small jar of salve to a sick child, and though the child recovered at the time, the memory now felt unsettling. Such recollections, once neutral, began twisting into accusations without ever needing to be spoken plainly. Tension among neighbors grew sharper, and conversations took on the weight of decision-making. Men who had once discussed weather and crops now found themselves speaking about protection and responsibility. Some believed the sickness might lift on its own, but many others felt that the community could no longer wait. A few described strange dreams, a sign, they said, that something unholy had taken root in the hills. One man claimed to have seen a figure near the woman's cabin at dusk, shadowed and impossible to identify. Another said his dog refused to hunt anywhere near her property. It mattered little whether any of these claims were true. They served their purpose, shaping the fear into something pointed and directional. Among the families affected by the illness, grief turned to anger. A mother who had lost her son insisted that the fever had begun shortly after the woman on the ridge visited their home, though the timeline was hazy and memories were unreliable. A farmer whose livestock had died remembered with troubling clarity that he had once argued with her about a borrow ditch that carried rainwater between their properties. Someone else recalled that she had declined an invitation to a winter gathering simply because she had been feeling unwell, yet that refusal was retold as an omen. By the time snow began to melt from the hillsides, these recollections had merged into something more ominous, a collective belief that the woman had, in some hidden way, become responsible for their suffering. Not because the evidence pointed to her, but because fear needed her. In such communities, fear does not remain scattered for long. It gathers around a single point like filings drawn to a magnet. People needed clarity, an anchor for their confusion. They found it in the figure of the solitary woman whose quiet life fit too easily into the shape of suspicion. And as more people repeated the same concerns, the idea hardened. Even those who doubted the rumors found themselves unwilling to speak against them. Silence, in times of fear, often becomes consent. By midwinter, a few men began meeting privately to discuss what could be done. These meetings were not formal, and no written records survive, but local memory suggests they took place in barns and clearing sheds, sometimes with lanterns, low to avoid attracting attention. The men spoke in the slow, measured tones of people who believed they were acting out of necessity, not malice. They discussed the sickness, the livestock deaths, the unease spread across the ridge, and they spoke of the woman. Some advocated confronting her directly. Others believed the community needed a larger gathering, a meeting where grievances could be aired and explanations offered. But beneath all the talk was a sense that they had already decided the outcome, even if no one admitted it aloud. Women also spoke among themselves, though their conversations were quieter, held along creeks during washing or whispered during evening chores. A few felt pity for the woman. Others believed she possessed knowledge they did not understand, which frightened them more deeply than any sickness. Children, meanwhile, absorbed the tension, their imaginations filling the gaps left by adult silence. A boy claimed he saw lights dancing near her cabin late at night, though he could not describe them. A girl said she dreamed of the woman standing at the foot of her bed, though she later admitted she had not been sure whether she was awake or asleep. Children's stories, unpredictable and vivid, drifted into adult circles and were accepted as further proof. In those days, a community's suspicions could grow legs quickly. With little access to outside authority, people relied on their own councils, families, and informal meetings. Justice and superstition were often tangled together, and when a community reached a certain threshold of fear, reason struggled to keep its footing. By early spring, that threshold had been crossed. Whatever patience had existed earlier vanished. One evening, as neighbors gathered in a barn warmed by a small fire, a man said plainly that something had to be done. Others nodded. A few exchanged wary looks, knowing the weight of the moment. Decisions like these never unfold dramatically. They emerge slowly, like a path worn down by many hesitant steps. Yet once the decision takes shape, it becomes difficult to turn back. The woman on the ridge remained unaware of the gathering storm around her. She continued her routine, tending her small garden, fetching water from the spring, visiting the woods when the weather allowed. Whether she sensed the change in how neighbors regarded her is unknown. People often feel the shift long before words confirm it. Perhaps she noticed fewer greetings at a distance. Perhaps she felt the weight of eyes lingering too long. Perhaps she simply attributed the change to the hardships of winter. What matters is that she was living her quiet, ordinary life at the very moment others were interpreting that life as something dangerous. Gradually, plans began forming to confront her. Some wanted the matter settled privately, believing that speaking to her directly might dispel their fears or force her to admit guilt, though what guilt could even mean in such circumstances was unclear. Others wanted the community gathered, witnesses present, the accusations laid out plainly. A few believed that only a dramatic confrontation could end the sickness. The reasoning varied, but the intention was the same: to unmask whatever force they believed had harmed them. And so, with the pines whispering overhead and the thaw releasing the cold grip of winter, a group of neighbors decided to act. They gathered at dusk, when shadows stretched long across the ridge, carrying lanterns and tools, though none admitted they would need them. The air held a tense quiet, the kind that arrives just before an argument or a storm. As they approached her cabin, someone tapped the handle of an axe against his leg. Once, twice, a hollow rhythm unsettling in its familiarity. It echoed faintly through the trees, the same sound some believed they had heard earlier in the season. That steady knocking seemed to carry the weight of everything that had led to this moment, and it is with that sound hanging in the evening air that the next part begins. The knocking drifted through the trees in a slow, rhythmic pattern, almost steady enough to resemble intention, yet too faint and uneven to confirm whether it came from a man's tool, a shifting branch, or something imagined by nerves stretched thin. Those who walked toward the cabin claimed later that the sound unsettled them even more than the purpose of their gathering. A hollow rhythm in a winter-thinned forest carries a strange quality, the sort that pricks at the back of the neck and stirs memories of old warnings passed through families long gone. As the group of neighbors moved along the narrow path toward the ridge, their steps were quiet, not from stealth, but from a shared heaviness, a sense that the night had drawn them into something none fully understood, yet all felt compelled to continue. Lanterns bobbed slightly with their movement. The lights cast long, trembling shadows across the ground, shadows that shivered between the roots of oak and cedar trees. The air carried a bite, the kind of lingering winter cold that sinks into clothing, no matter how tightly one pulls a coat around the shoulders. Every man in the group felt the cold, though none mentioned it. They walked without words, as if speaking aloud might break whatever spell held them together. Some were motivated by genuine fear for their families, others by anger that demanded a place to land. A few walked simply because everyone else did. In small communities, participation can feel like duty, and duty can obscure one's own doubts. As the cabin came into sight, its outline dark against the dim sky, an uneasy silence settled over the group. They waited in a loose cluster, unsure of how to begin. The woman's home, though simple, had a sturdiness to it. Smoke from the chimney rose in a thin line, suggesting she was inside, tending to her stove or preparing her evening meal. A faint glow flickered through a small window, the window she used to let air out during cooking. Nothing about the cabin appeared threatening. It looked like a place shaped by hard work and solitude, a haven built by someone who had known loss and chosen to bear it quietly. Yet when fear grows large enough, even the most ordinary shapes begin to look uncanny. One man commented softly that the light inside seemed too still, though it was no different from any other cabin's glow. Another wondered how she could remain alone in such a place during these troubling times, interpreting her solitude as defiance rather than circumstance. The assumptions passed quickly between them, each man strengthening the next, until they felt justified in stepping forward. The group's informal leader, a farmer named Latham, finally cleared his throat. He had lost 2 animals in recent weeks and believed the sickness had touched his household more harshly than others. Grief and frustration sat heavily on his shoulders. He knocked on the door first, a solid, purposeful sound that carried across the clearing. The cabin's interior went still. The flicker of lamplight paused briefly, as though the woman inside had sensed more than the presence of visitors, perhaps the weight of intention behind their arrival. Only a moment passed before her voice, calm and steady, asked who was there. Her tone was ordinary, but the men heard it differently. They heard defiance or suspicion where there was none. They interpreted stillness as cunning, hesitation as concealment. When she finally opened the door, stepping into the lantern glow, her face appeared tired, not dangerous. Worry lines shaped her eyes, and her hands, though steady, bore the calluses of a woman who worked the land with little help. She looked first at Latham, then at the men behind him, and one could almost sense the quiet dread rising within her as she realized they had not come simply to check on her welfare. Their questions came slow at first, layered in politeness, as though they were trying to maintain a veneer of civility. They asked whether she had noticed anything unusual, whether she had heard strange noises or sensed troubling signs. She answered honestly, though her responses did little to calm them. Fear has a way of interpreting truth as misdirection. They pressed on, their voices growing firmer. Had she quarreled with anyone recently? Had she seen sick livestock near her property? Had she walked the ridge at night? Each question, though seemingly simple, carried an unspoken accusation beneath it. The woman grew tense, realizing they were not simply gathering information, they were gathering justification. She tried explaining the herbs she collected, naming them in detail: ginseng, bloodroot, sassafras, plants she used for teas and salves. But as she spoke, the men exchanged glances. Her knowledge, once harmless, now seemed threatening. One man muttered that such plants could harm as easily as heal. Another murmured that he had heard stories of women who used such things for darker purposes. The air thickened with suspicion, and the woman sensed it. She tried maintaining her composure, but her voice tightened around her words, revealing the fear growing inside her. It was then that Latham mentioned the sickness. The pattern he believed had followed her movements. He claimed that each homestead she had visited in recent months had suffered misfortune soon after. Whether this was true or simply a coincidence, reshaped into a narrative, no one could say. Memory, in moments like these, bends to fit emotion. The woman denied the accusation, her voice trembling now. She insisted she had stayed near her cabin for most of the season, weakened herself by a lingering cough. She reminded them that she had helped neighbors in the past, cared for sick children, even shared her limited supplies when others struggled through the lean months. But when fear grows communal, individual truth is powerless against it. A few men stepped closer, their lanterns casting sharper light across her face. Her fear became visible then, and the appearance of fear in the accused can, tragically, be interpreted as confirmation in the minds of the accusers. They asked whether she had harmed the valley. They asked whether she had used her herbs for curses. They asked whether she had consorted with spirits. Their questions grew sharper, the tone cutting through the winter air like the edge of a blade. No one shouted. Rage was not what drove them. Something quieter and perhaps more dangerous had taken hold, a collective certainty that they were acting for the good of their community. Even as they confronted her, many believed they were doing the right thing. That belief steadied their voices, even as the woman trembled before them. Her silence after one particular question, whether she would swear before God that she had caused no harm, hung in the air too long. She hesitated, not from guilt, but from the weight of the moment. But to the men gathered there, the pause sealed her fate. Someone suggested she be brought to a more formal gathering, a meeting of families to hear the accusations properly. Others argued that immediate action was needed. Their conflicting voices rose only slightly before settling again into a grim resolve. The woman stood in her doorway, one hand gripping the frame, as the lantern lights wavered across her face. She understood then that whatever decision they made, her voice alone would not be enough to change it. In the tense stillness that followed, a sudden gust of wind moved through the trees behind the cabin, rattling the bare branches. The sound startled the group, not because it was unusual, but because their nerves were wound so tightly that even the natural rhythm of the forest felt ominous. The wind carried with it a faint moaning sound, one often heard in winter woods, yet on that night it seemed charged with meaning. Someone muttered that it was a sign. Another nodded, interpreting nature through the lens of their fear. The confrontation did not end that night, but its outcome had already taken shape. The men stepped back from the doorway, their lanterns forming a loose semicircle in the cold clearing. The woman remained where she stood, watching them go, knowing that something irreversible had begun. She closed the door slowly, the wood creaking in the quiet, the latch falling into place with a soft click that lingered like a heartbeat in the dark. Outside, the men walked away, their conversation hushed and urgent. They had not harmed her, but they had crossed a threshold that would lead them towards something resembling judgment, if not legal judgment, then communal. The ridge felt heavier as they left, as though the night had absorbed the weight of their fears. Far behind them, inside the small cabin, the woman leaned against the wall, her breath unsteady, listening to the fading footsteps. She knew the community's suspicion had reached a point from which it would not return easily. And as she listened, another sound rose faintly in the distance, not knocking this time, but a soft, uncertain cry carried by the wind, too distant to identify, too strange to ignore. It was that unanswered cry, restless and trembling, that would linger in the valley long after the men returned home. And it is with that fragile, unsettling sound that the next part of the story begins. The cry that drifted across the ridge that night became the thread on which the next days quietly hung, for every person who heard it, or imagined they did, carried its echo into their homes, letting it settle beside their fears like a reminder of unfinished business. Even those who had not joined the confrontation sensed a shift in the valley's mood by morning. Something had changed, though nothing visible marked the difference. Smoke still curled from cabin chimneys, roosters still called at dawn, and the creek still murmured its winter song. Yet families moved through their chores with a cautious tension, glancing toward the ridge more than usual, waiting for news or confirmation of the uneasy stillness that had settled over the land. The men who had stood at the woman's door returned to their homes with stiff shoulders and quiet minds. Some lay awake, unsure whether their actions had brought comfort or unease. Others slept fitfully, their dreams shaped by the sight of the woman's frightened face. But by morning, most had convinced themselves that they were acting out of necessity. People have a way of mending their own doubts when fear offers them a clear enough purpose. And in this valley, where sickness had taken root and grief had worn down patience, the idea of confronting the supposed source felt like a way to regain control. It was easier somehow to believe in a human cause than to accept the randomness of illness. Word of the confrontation spread slowly through the valley. carried not by deliberate storytelling, but through fragments of conversation overheard at springs, fence lines, and gathering places. Some told it with sympathy for the woman, suggesting that suspicion had clouded judgment. Others recounted it with the weight of grim necessity, believing that the men had acted with courage. As the story moved from ear to ear, small details shifted. One person claimed the woman had refused to look the men in the eye. Another said she had done nothing but stare at the ground. Someone else insisted she had spoken to them in a tone too calm to be natural. In this way, the memory of the night expanded beyond what had occurred, gaining sharper edges and darker shadows with every retelling. By the second evening after the confrontation, a group of men gathered again, this time at Latham's barn, a central spot often used for meetings during harvest or emergencies. Lanterns hung from beams overhead, casting a warm but trembling light across the hay-strewn floor. The men arrived one by one, shoulders wrapped in heavy coats, breath visible in the cold. No one suggested turning back or postponing the discussion. They stepped into the barn with the quiet certainty of men who had already chosen the direction the community would take. The meeting began with long silence. Those gathered did not want to speak hastily, for they understood the weight of their decisions, even if they would not say so. The illness had persisted, and another homestead reported losing livestock earlier that day, a mule that had shown no signs of distress until it collapsed suddenly. The timing struck many as too close to the confrontation to ignore. This was how fear tightened its hold, aligning unrelated events until they formed what appeared to be a coherent thread. Someone muttered that the sickness seemed angrier now, as though reacting to their visit. Another nodded slowly, interpreting the coincidence as a sign that the woman knew she was under suspicion and had responded with malice. They discussed the possibility of bringing her before a larger gathering of families, perhaps at the small clearing where community meetings had been held in better years. Such a gathering would give structure to their accusations, though no one asked who would lead it or what authority they held. Formality, even in appearance alone, felt like a step toward legitimacy. And in times of uncertainty, legitimacy, whether earned or constructed, becomes a comforting shield. Some of the men believed the community needed this sense of structure if they were to confront the sickness with unity, while others simply wanted closure. A few men expressed hesitation. They urged caution, suggesting that the sickness might still have natural causes and that confronting the woman further might bring more harm than good. Their voices were calm but strained, like men speaking through a fog of doubt. But for every cautious voice, there were others hardened by grief. A father who had buried his daughter 3 weeks earlier asked how much more the valley was expected to endure. Another man, whose wife had been bedridden for months, insisted that action needed to be taken before more families suffered. Emotion sharpened their tone, and soon the cautious voices fell silent, not out of agreement, but out of recognition that they could not halt the momentum now forming. The decision was made to summon the woman to a communal meeting. The men believed this would allow her a chance to defend herself, though privately many doubted she could say anything that would change their minds. The meeting would be held in 2 days' time, giving neighbors enough time to prepare and gather. They planned to speak to her again at first light to inform her of the gathering and escort her if necessary. Their words were measured, but beneath them lay an unspoken certainty. Whatever happened at that meeting would shape the valley's future. Whether through resolution or through consequences, they could not yet foresee. As the men prepared to leave the barn, a sudden rush of cold wind tore through the open doorway, extinguishing one of the lanterns. The unexpected darkness startled them. A few exchanged uneasy glances, interpreting the moment in the context of their fear. Someone muttered that the valley seemed restless, as though resisting what was being planned. Another dismissed the comment, insisting it was only the night playing tricks. But the moment lingered, heavy and unresolved, as they stepped out into the cold, their boots crunching on frost-hardened ground. Meanwhile, the woman on the ridge spent her nights in solitude, knowing little of the conversations unfolding in barns and along fence lines. She sensed the change in the air, though. People notice when neighbors avoid their gaze or hurry past without greeting. She noticed the silence that followed her arrival at the spring, the absence of visitors who once came by to borrow flour or share news. Fear gathered around her home, though she could not yet see its full shape. The cry that had drifted across the ridge 2 nights earlier still echoed in her mind. She wondered whether it had been an animal, a dream, or something else entirely. Solitude sharpens one's senses, but it also deepens uncertainty. She went about her chores with growing unease. When she stepped outside to gather firewood, she caught herself glancing toward the path more often. When she prepared her evening meal, she paused frequently to listen for sounds beyond the walls, footsteps, voices, anything that might confirm the dread she felt. Even her small garden, brown and brittle from winter, felt different. The land seemed tense, as though awaiting a change. On the morning the men approached her cabin again, she'd already sensed their arrival. Footsteps through dried leaves carry differently when a group approaches. She stepped outside before they could knock, her eyes weary but steady. The men delivered their message with formality, telling her she was expected at a community gathering. She asked for what purpose, though she already suspected the answer. When they spoke of concern and questions needing answers, she understood that the meeting would not be a fair hearing. It would be a judgment, shaped not by truth, but by fear. Still, she agreed to come. Refusing would only deepen suspicion. Her voice wavered slightly as she spoke, but she held her composure. The men left her cabin with the same rigid posture they had arrived with, though a few avoided meeting her eyes. Guilt has its own weight, and some felt it even then, though they would not name it. The valley prepared for the gathering over the next 2 days. Families whispered their expectations, children clung to parents with unease, and even the dogs moved restlessly, barking at shadows that drifted too close to the edge of lamplight. The sickness had not lifted. Another horse fell ill. A family found their well water muddy, though the cause was likely natural. But in the atmosphere of mounting dread, these events intertwined, feeding the fear that had now grown larger than any one person. When the day of the gathering arrived, clouds hung low over the ridge, muting the light. People walked slowly toward the clearing, their breaths visible in the cold air, their faces heavy with worry, anger, or uncertainty. The woman arrived last, escorted by 2 men who kept a respectful but firm distance. The crowd fell silent as she approached. Her steps were slow, steady, more resigned than defiant. She took her place near the center, facing the semicircle of neighbors who had once offered her kindness. The clearing felt colder than usual, the trees standing stiff as witnesses. Children huddled close to their mothers. Men positioned themselves with grave formality. A hush settled over the valley as though the land itself held its breath. And it is in that silence, thick, heavy, and edged with judgment, that the next part of the story begins. The silence in the clearing pressed in from every direction, so complete that even the restless shifting of horses on the outskirts seemed muffled by it. A thin mist clung to the ground, rising from the damp earth in faint curls, softening the shapes of boots, skirts, and roots along the edges. The woman stood very still, her hands gathered in front of her, fingers interlocked so tightly that her knuckles paled. She waited for someone to speak, for the first stone of accusation to be lifted, though she already sensed how the morning would unfold. The crowd, large for such a scattered valley, seemed to breathe as a single uneasy creature, its lungs filling with cold air, its thoughts aligned more by fear than reason. At length, Latham stepped forward. He had not intended to lead, but his grief, anger, and the memory of the mule lying motionless outside his barn had hardened into a determination he could no longer bury. His voice, when it finally broke the stillness, wavered only slightly. He spoke of sickness, of loss, of patterns he believed he had seen in the valley. His words were measured and careful, not the wild accusations of someone driven by rage, but the slow, deliberate presentation of a case woven from sorrow and uncertainty. He did not call the woman a witch, not at first. Instead, he spoke of misfortune, the uncanny timing of events, the strange weakening of livestock, and how these troubles always seemed to follow a quiet trail that led back to her ridge. As he spoke, others nodded, their faces pale in the cold light. Some crossed their arms as if warding off a chill. A few looked at the ground, unwilling to reveal the conflict stirring in their minds. The woman listened with a steady expression, though her breath grew shallow. She felt the crowd's attention surrounding her like a tightening ring. When Latham paused, another man stepped forward, adding his own testimony. He described the night he had heard a knocking sound from the woods near her cabin, the same hollow rhythm that had haunted the valley for weeks. He mentioned lights, flickers between the trees that he could not explain. He recalled seeing her walking the ridge at dusk, her footsteps slow, her expression unreadable. Each statement, though innocent enough on its own, layered suspicion onto suspicion until the impression became heavy and ominous. A woman from the back of the crowd spoke next, her voice trembling. She described the sudden relapse of her daughter, how the child's fever had returned without warning. She reminded those gathered that the last visitor to her home before the relapse had been the woman now standing before them. Memory, sharpened by fear, took on a clarity that may not have been true but felt true. The mother's grief thickened her voice, and the valley listened with a reverence shaped by sympathy. Grief carries authority in small communities. Her words weighed more heavily than facts. The accused woman lifted her head and answered the testimonies with quiet dignity. She explained that she had visited the sick child only to bring herbs, the same herbs she had given to others in the valley over the years. She reminded them how often her remedies had helped. She pointed out that sickness often returned without cause, that fevers rose and fell unpredictably in the mountains. She spoke of the mule's death, of the livestock that had weakened, explaining how harsh winters, contaminated feed, or unseen disease could claim animals suddenly. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled. She knew reason struggled to survive in the presence of collective fear. Yet the valley listened. Not everyone believed her guilty. A few voices rose in her defense, though hesitantly. One man reminded the crowd how she had tended to his wife after childbirth. Another mentioned how she had shared vegetables from her garden during a drought, how she never asked for payment. These defenders spoke softly, afraid of opposing the rising tide. Their caution weakened their words, and though the crowd heard them, their memories had already begun to arrange themselves into a narrative in which her kindness appeared suspicious rather than virtuous. A healer too skilled in herbs could be mistaken for something darker. A woman too comfortable in solitude might seem unnatural in a world where community was expected. As the exchange went on, stories began to drift in from the edges of memory. Old tales brought by settlers generations earlier, stories of women in faraway places who had been accused of similar things. Someone mentioned the old hex traditions of the Pennsylvania Dutch, brought westward by families who passed through the region. Another referenced a story told by his grandfather about a healer back east who'd been blamed for a series of child deaths. These accounts were vague, fragmented by years and retellings, yet they added a mythic undertone to the accusations rising in the clearing. The valley, already steeped in fear, absorbed these tales as though they validated the suspicions surrounding the woman. Then came the moment that shifted the tone from uneasy speculation to something more dangerous. A young man, no more than 20, stepped forward and said he had seen the woman standing outside her cabin late at night, her face lit by moonlight, whispering into the wind. He insisted she had raised her arms as though directing something unseen. The claim hung in the air like smoke. The woman denied it quickly, explaining that she often stepped outside at night to cool her lungs during coughing fits. But the young man's certainty, whether genuine or the result of fear-drenched imagination, held the crowd's attention tightly. Someone whispered that certain spells were said to be conducted under moonlight. Someone else murmured that the ridge had always felt strange. The atmosphere thickened, not with anger, but with a somber gravity. The clearing grew quieter still, the only sound the occasional creak of a tree bending under the weight of cold air. The woman looked around her, seeing familiar faces fixed in expressions she no longer recognized. People she had known for years now regarded her with eyes clouded by dread. The moment felt slow, suspended, as if the valley itself waited for a verdict. Then a voice from the back broke through, a frail, wavering voice belonging to an elderly woman known for her sharp mind and long memory. She stepped forward with effort, leaning on a walking stick. Her presence quieted the murmurs. She spoke not of herbs or sickness, but of balance. How communities sometimes lost their way when fear outweighed understanding. She reminded them that misfortune did not always have a human cause. Her words, though wise, carried only a fraction of the weight they might have in calmer days. People listened respectfully, but the fear had already grown too large. Wisdom struggles to compete with the collective momentum of a frightened community. The accused woman attempted one last time to reach them. Her voice, though trembling, held sincerity. She spoke of her husband, of the life she had tried to rebuild after losing him. She spoke of the loneliness that had driven her into the woods to gather herbs, not out of secrecy, but because work kept her grief quiet. She told them she had never wished harm upon anyone, that their fear wounded her more deeply than the illness itself. For a moment, her words seemed to soften the air. A few faces wavered, their expressions shifting with flickers of doubt. But doubt is fragile when fear is strong. And someone, no one later recalled exactly who, asked her to swear before God that she had no part in the suffering. She hesitated. The pause lasted only a heartbeat, but in that space the crowd read meaning that did not exist. Her hesitation was the breath of someone overwhelmed, yet to the watchers it felt like revelation. A ripple of uneasy murmurs swept through the clearing. With the mood shifted, the testimonies began again, shorter now, more pointed, each adding to the building momentum. People spoke of bad luck, strange noises, animals refusing to approach her land. Though none of these stories offered proof, the accumulation of fear and coincidence formed its own logic. A community burdened by grief does not need certainty, it needs resolution. As the final voices trailed off, the clearing fell silent. Every person there felt the weight of the moment. The woman stood alone in the center, her breath visible in the cold. The crowd waited, suspended between decision and consequence. The trial, though informal, had reached a peak from which there would be no turning back. And it is in this trembling silence, heavy with expectation and darkened by the collective fear of the valley, that the next part of the story begins. The silence at the close of the gathering settled so thickly over the clearing that even after the crowd dispersed, it seemed to cling to the branches and drift along the ridge like an unseen fog. Neighbors left in small clusters, some speaking in hushed tones, others saying nothing at all. The woman remained only a moment longer, her gaze lingering on the emptying space, as though trying to memorize the contours of the moment that had reshaped her fate. She walked home, escorted but unrestrained, though everyone who watched her go sensed that the valley had crossed into a place from which it could not return easily. Even those who doubted her guilt felt that something had shifted permanently, something neither illness nor winter nor prayer could erase. By the time the last lantern light faded down the path, the clearing held only the faint echo of voices and the weight of a decision that had not been spoken but had undeniably formed. Across the Ozarks, in hollows tucked between ridges and in cabins scattered along trace paths, stories of witches had drifted for generations. some arriving with settlers from the east, some carried from older countries, others born from moments just like this, where fear and mystery tangled together until truth grew indistinguishable from legend. To understand what happened in that clearing, one must understand the soil in which such fears took root. The Ozarks were, in many ways, a crossroads of belief. The Bible lay open on nearly every cabin table, yet alongside it rested old-world superstitions, Appalachian tales, and whispers of hexes and counter-charms. People lived close to the land, close to silence, and close to forces they could not always name. And in this isolated wilderness, far from doctors, formal courts, and consistent clergy, the line between faith and folklore blurred like smoke shifting in lamplight. Witch stories in the Ozarks rarely resembled the dramatic accounts found in New England. They were quieter, more personal, rooted not in theology but in everyday fear. A cow that stopped giving milk, a baby who cried through the night, a pig found dead without injury. These were the seeds from which accusations sprouted. Families told of strange dreams, charms left beneath thresholds, and warnings carved into barn beams to ward off unseen harm. Some claimed that certain women were cunning, able to heal or harm with equal ease. Others spoke of men marked by curses, their luck spoiled by a single glance. And though few would admit openly to believing in witches, nearly everyone carried a charm against being cursed, an iron nail in the doorway, a Bible verse written on a scrap of paper, a pinch of salt tossed over the shoulder when something felt off. These practices whispered truths about the valley. Fear lived here long before the sickness of 1859. Travelers passing through the region often remarked on the dual nature of Ozark belief. Ministers preached repentance, salvation, and divine order, yet in the same breath warned against signs of dark influence, milk that soured too quickly, fire logs that cracked strangely in the hearth, animals that refused to cross a particular stretch of trail. People believed deeply in God, and just as deeply in the possibility that danger could come from places beyond human sight. This combination of faith and superstition did not weaken them, it simply reflected the uncertainty of frontier life. With few institutions to rely on, people built their understanding of the world from scriptures, stories, and the patterns they perceived in the land itself. Among the more persistent folklore traditions was the belief in witch marks, signs that misfortune had been directed by a human hand rather than fate. A rust-colored ring around a cow's neck could be seen as evidence of a curse. A sudden chill passing through a closed room might be interpreted as a spirit's intrusion. Children were taught to avoid looking directly into the eyes of certain individuals, lest their health be pulled away. It was not that people wanted to believe such things. Rather, these stories offered a framework in which to place suffering. When crops failed without explanation, when illness appeared suddenly and took a life, the belief in witchcraft answered questions that otherwise would remain unbearably open. The Ozarks also carried remnants of European folk healing traditions. Some families practiced simple forms of powwow or witch doctoring, though under different names. These healers, often older women, used herbs, poultices, whispered prayers, and knowledge inherited across generations. Most were respected. A few were quietly feared. Their remedies were called upon in times of sickness. But if a cure failed or harm followed, the healer's reputation could turn dark. This duality, revered when things went well, condemned when things went wrong, formed part of the delicate balance of Ozark life. Into this world of layered belief stepped the woman at the center of the Alpena fear. She collected herbs. She lived alone. She walked at dusk. These traits placed her within a category that the community, in calmer moments, might have admired. But misfortune changes how people interpret the familiar. The same herbs once used to soothe aches now seemed suspicious. The same solitude once accepted as personal preference now looked like secrecy. The same nighttime walks once attributed to her restless thoughts now appeared ritualistic. In a vacuum of certainty, fear repurposed every memory into evidence. The valley's folk stories only intensified these interpretations. Tales told quietly in winter months resurfaced now with startling clarity. Some recalled the story of a woman from the early settlement era who, according to legend, could hag-ride men in their sleep, leaving them breathless and exhausted upon waking. Others mentioned a tale of a healer who had been said to curse cornfields when crossed or offended. These stories, vague and ancient, seeped into the minds of those judging the woman on the ridge. They provided context where none was needed, giving shape to fears that would otherwise remain nebulous. Even the natural environment contributed to these anxieties. The Ozark hills have an uncanny quality. Echoes travel unpredictably, shadows stretch and twist between trees, mist rises quickly in low hollows, and wildlife can fall silent without warning. To those living in such landscapes, the uncanny becomes part of daily life. Sounds like the hollow knocking heard in recent weeks found easy purchase in imaginations already primed for fear. A deer's startled cry might transform into something unearthly when heard in the darkness. A distant owl could be mistaken for a woman's voice. The land itself seemed to participate in the creation of folklore, amplifying fears into stories. But the most powerful force shaping the valley's perception was not the land or the stories. It was suffering. Families who had lost loved ones sought answers, and answers built from superstition can become more convincing than those built from uncertainty. The sickness, erratic, unexplainable, and cruel, demanded a cause. It demanded someone to blame. In the absence of medical knowledge, folklore became both explanation and defense. Some might ask how an entire community could allow fear to take hold so deeply. Yet history shows that fear never arrives empty-handed. It brings along memory, grief, and unanswered questions. And when these mingle in a place steeped in old traditions, a powerful narrative takes shape. The people of Alpena did not invent the idea of witchcraft out of malice. They reached for the explanations familiar to them, explanations woven into the stories told by their ancestors beside hearth fires. In that sense, the confrontation and the gathering in the clearing were not simply reactions to illness. They were echoes of centuries-old beliefs carried into a new land, reborn through circumstance. Understanding this context does not justify what happened next, but it illuminates the roots of the fear that drove the valley toward its grim conclusion. For the trial, informal as it was, did not originate in a single gathering or a single accusation. It grew from a landscape where faith and superstition overlapped, where hardship demanded meaning, and where the boundaries between truth and folklore had long been porous. And so, as the woman stood in the clearing, facing the eyes of her neighbors, she was not contending only with their judgments. She was facing the weight of a region's inherited fears, the ghost stories carried through generations, the dark reflections of all the suffering that had touched the valley. These forces, once stirred, are not easily calmed. When the crowd finally began to murmur again, slowly, hesitantly, it was clear that they were no longer merely recounting grievances. They were interpreting her life through the lens of all the stories they had ever heard about witches in the hills. And it is from this collective reimagining, this blending of fear with folklore, that the next part of the story rises. The murmurs in the clearing thickened into something heavier than conversation, something shaped more by atmosphere than words. People shifted their weight, glanced sideways at neighbors, and tucked their hands deeper into coat sleeves, as if the cold itself were waiting for a cue to deepen. The woman at the center did not move. Her stillness invited interpretation, quiet defiance to some, shock to others, guilt to a few, sorrow to the very few who still remembered her as anything other than the figure everyone else now feared. A trial, even an informal one, has a way of transforming the air around it. It draws in all the unspoken tension of a community, concentrates it, and then releases it in slow, shape-shifting waves. And in that moment, as the crowd settled into an uneasy hush, the valley braced itself for whatever would rise next from their collective fear. What followed was less a structured proceeding than a crescendo, a gradual tightening of voices, glances, and impressions. An older man who seldom spoke publicly stepped forward and recounted a moment from early winter when he had passed the woman's cabin and seen her sitting outside long after dark, staring into a fire that gave off almost no smoke. He described how her silhouette had appeared too still, how the flames had seemed to bend strangely around her shape. It was likely nothing more than the flicker of wind, the tricks of a tired mind, but told in this setting, under this cloud of suspicion, the story took on an eerie significance. People leaned in, listening not for logic but for confirmation of what they now feared was true. Another man followed, speaking of a dream he had experienced just nights before, a vision of the ridge shrouded in smoke and the woman standing at its center with outstretched arms. He admitted the dream felt real enough that he'd woken with a shout. Dreams hold power in isolated regions, especially dreams told aloud. When someone dreams of danger, others feel it. A dream can become evidence if enough listeners nod slowly and decide the subconscious must have sensed something the waking mind could not. And nod they did. Even those who doubted dreams carried meaning felt the prickle of unease travel up their arms. More testimonies surfaced, each one adding another thread to the tapestry of fear. A woman described how her chickens had refused to roost one night after the accused passed by her property. A young boy claimed he had seen a black shape perched on the woman's roof after midnight, though the details slipped when pressed. Wings at first, then no wings, then glowing eyes, then none at all. Yet uncertainty did not weaken his story. To some, the shifting details made it feel more mysterious, more uncanny, more believable within the porous border between truth and folklore. The woman's responses remained steady, though tension tightened her voice. She explained again that she walked at dusk because the valley air was gentler then, that she stared into low-burning fires because they helped her think during long nights alone. She reminded them that dreams were only dreams, and that children often saw shapes in the dark that were nothing more than shadows or wind. But her explanations, however logical, fell into a well that no longer held room for reason. Once a community reaches this point, when fear becomes the container into which every story is poured, truth becomes slippery, difficult to grasp. Then came a moment that shifted the entire gathering, the way a sudden gust can change the direction of smoke. A man named Huxley stepped forward, a figure known for his temper and grief in equal measure. His wife had been bedridden for months. He had watched her strength fade in ways he could not understand. He was not a man inclined toward superstition in calmer years, but desperation carves new paths through the mind. His voice cracked as he spoke. He said his wife had whispered a name in her fevered dreams, and though he did not want to believe it, the name was the woman's. He admitted with trembling breath that he feared the illness might not be entirely natural. The crowd stiffened. Fever dreams had meaning here. People believed that the sick, balanced precariously between life and death, sometimes glimpsed truths hidden from the healthy. Whether Huxley's wife had truly spoken a name or whether his grief reshaped memory could not be known. Yet in the clearing under the gray morning sky, his words carried a weight that pressed down on everyone present. They created a silence more profound than any that had preceded it. The woman closed her eyes briefly, her face tight with sorrow rather than fear. She insisted she had done nothing, that the valley's suffering was not her doing. She begged them to see her as they once had, as a widow surviving quietly on the ridge, working with plants because that was how she had been taught to endure. But her pleas, though heartfelt, slid across the surface of their fear without sinking in. And then someone asked the question no one had spoken aloud until now: should she be judged today? The words did not echo, but they seemed to reverberate inside every person's chest. A few gasped softly. Others lowered their heads. The clearing seemed to shrink, drawing the woman and the crowd closer together. Nothing in the valley's tradition resembled a formal court, yet here they were, standing on the edge of creating something that looked and felt like judgment. Frontier justice was rarely legalistic. It was an agreement, a consensus shaped by necessity and fear. And in that moment, the valley teetered on the brink of such a consensus. A man from the back suggested they pray first. Heads bowed. The woman bowed too. The prayer was long, heavy, filled with pleas for clarity, protection, and courage. It did not mention her directly, yet every word felt pointed toward her fate. When the prayer ended, the silence returned, deeper than before, as though the entire ridge were listening. It was at that instant that nature intervened. A sudden gust of wind tore through the clearing, whipping skirts and coats, snapping loose branches from nearby trees. Leaves that had clung stubbornly to oaks all winter, finally released, twisting through the air. The wind carried a hollow, low-pitched moan as it passed across the ridge, a sound that might have been nothing more than air moving through cold branches, yet it felt charged with meaning. People flinched. Children pressed into their mothers. Even the dogs at the clearing's edge whined and shifted back. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The woman's face paled, though her expression remained resolute. The sound lingered, then tapered, leaving behind a stillness more unsettling than the wind itself. It was at this moment, when nature offered an ambiguous sign, that the crowd's uncertainty crystallized into conviction for many. A sign, they whispered, a warning, a confirmation. Each person interpreted the moment through the lens of their deepest fear. The makeshift trial reached its peak in that charged silence. Questions were raised again, sharper now, pressing her to confess, to repent, to explain the unexplained. Some demanded she reveal what herbs she used. Others insisted she name anyone she might have wronged. The rapid shift in tone narrowed around her like a tightening ring. She tried to answer, but her words were swallowed by the rising fervor of the crowd. Voices overlapped. Fear, anger, grief, confusion, all forming a storm around the woman standing alone in the center of the clearing. The trial had reached its climax, and though no verdict had been spoken, its shape had already taken form in the minds of many. As the crowd surged with emotion, a single crow broke from a nearby tree, its wings beating loudly in the frozen air, its cry sharp enough to slice through the noise. It was that cry, piercing, unexpected and stark against the winter sky, that opened the doorway into the next part of the story. The crow's cry cut through the rising clamor so sharply that it brought every voice in the clearing to an abrupt halt. Its sound was harsh and ragged, the kind that seemed to tear a seam in the air itself. People froze where they stood, their faces tilting upward as the black bird lifted into the gray sky, its wings beating with an almost desperate urgency. It circled once above the gathering, once and only once, before disappearing beyond the ridge. And when it was gone, the silence that remained felt different from the silences before. This one held an edge, a tautness born from the crowd's belief that they had just seen a sign, though no two people interpreted it in the same way. The woman, still standing alone at the center, felt the silence press deep into her bones. She sensed that whatever happened next, this moment, the crow, the wind, the breathless crowd, would be remembered long after those present had left the earth. For a long while, no one spoke. It was as though the entire valley had inhaled and forgotten how to release that breath. The men who had questioned her moments earlier now exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether the crow's cry had confirmed their fears or chastised them. The women drew their children close, their shawls fluttering lightly in the settling breeze. A few felt tears pricking at their eyes but could not say why. Even the dogs stood rigid, ears pricked, their usual fidgeting stilled by an instinct older than the settlement itself. Finally, a voice rose from the crowd, a soft, trembling voice belonging to a man named Weaver, known for his calm judgment and steady manner. He lifted his hand not in accusation, but in a gesture requesting attention. His voice, when he spoke, carried no anger or zeal. He said simply that they needed to decide, here and now, what course their community would take. He reminded them that the sickness had ravaged their families, and that fear, if left untended, could bring ruin as surely as disease. He urged them to consider not just the accusations, but also the possibility of being wrong. His words hung in the air, gentle but insufficient. The moment required something heavier than reason, and the valley, steeped in fear, was not ready to receive caution as leadership. Another voice, stronger, harsher, cut into the space Weaver had opened. This time it was Huxley. His grief had shaped itself into a blade, and he wielded it now without hesitation. He spoke of his wife's whispered dreams, of the fever that had stolen her strength, of the timing he could not dismiss. His words trembled with emotion, and as he spoke, the crowd's sympathy leaned toward him as if weighted by the pull of his suffering. Grief carries its own persuasion, thick and undeniable. When he finished, the clearing filled once again with murmurs, though now they leaned more heavily toward a single direction. The accused woman remained silent. She knew that anything she said could be twisted, misheard, or transformed into further suspicion. Even so, when someone asked her whether she had harmed the valley, she raised her head and answered with trembling clarity, "No." The word carried through the clearing like a fragile thing set loose in a strong wind. For some, her denial stirred doubt. For others, it felt too simple, too small, too practiced. In fear-filled gatherings, truth rarely speaks loudly enough. A few neighbors requested that she swear again, this time invoking divine judgment. When she hesitated, not because she was guilty, but because the moment felt suffocating, the hesitation itself became evidence in their eyes. Someone claimed she had paused too long. Someone else insisted she had whispered something under her breath. The claims multiplied faster than breath could dispute them. Even those who had once defended her found themselves shaken. It was then that Latham stepped forward again. His grief, though quieter than Huxley's, ran deep. He spoke firmly, declaring that the valley could not endure more sickness, more dead livestock, more fear. He did not call for violence, he did not demand punishment, but he insisted that they needed clarity, and if clarity required pressing the woman further, then so be it. His words were spoken with a grim steadiness that suggested he believed he had reached a point from which he could not turn back. Others took up his sentiment. Some wanted her confined for a time, watched by a group of men until the sickness passed or worsened. Others argued that the valley needed a ritual of protection, something symbolic, something that felt like action, whether or not it had basis in scripture or superstition. A few called for harsher measures, their voices low but unmistakable. The gathering had become a slow-moving storm, one fueled by fear rather than fury, but no less dangerous. The woman's eyes swept the circle of faces surrounding her. She recognized fear, pain, and confusion. She recognized desperation. She recognized the loneliness of standing against the beliefs of an entire community. Somewhere inside her, she understood that, regardless of what happened next, the valley she had called home no longer held a place for her. The land might welcome her still, but the people, those whose families she had helped, whose children she had soothed, whose gardens she had shared bounty with, were slipping away behind the fog of fear and legend. A moment arrived when everything in the clearing seemed to hold still, a pause between breath and sound, a space where the outcome balanced precariously. It was the kind of moment in which a single word could shift everything, in which courage or fear could seize control, in which mercy could rise if summoned strongly enough. But nothing rose. No one spoke words that might have saved her. Instead, the wind stirred again, not with the violence of earlier, but with a soft persistence. It moved through the trees, bending a few dried grasses at the edge of the clearing. The sound, though gentle, felt strangely final. The crowd interpreted it as the land itself acknowledging their next step. So it was decided, not by a formal vote, not by explicit declaration, but by the slow, collective tightening of faces and nods, that she would be taken under guard to a cabin at the lower end of the valley, where she could be kept until a more permanent judgment could be reached. It was a compromise, a middle ground, one that allowed those wary of harsher measures to believe they had chosen mercy, while those craving resolution believed they had taken a step toward restoring order. The woman did not resist when two men approached. She lowered her gaze and allowed them to guide her through the clearing, her footsteps slow but steady. A few people turned away as she passed. Others stared openly, their eyes fixed with an intensity shaped by fear. Children watched with confused expressions, sensing the heaviness without understanding its cause. As they led her away, the clearing remained frozen in a kind of suspended grief. Conversations resumed slowly, quietly. People drifted back to their homes, each carrying a version of the event that would later become part of the valley's scattered record, a story shaped by their own fears, memories, and interpretations. By the time the sun reached its low winter arc, the clearing lay empty once more. At the far end of the valley, the cabin where she would be kept stood silent, a simple structure used occasionally by travelers or hunters. It held no comfort. It held no familiarity, yet it was there that she was placed, with a small lantern, a blanket, and the promise that someone would bring food and water until the community determined her fate. As evening settled over the ridge, the sky deepened into a bruised shade of blue. The first stars flickered faintly through a thin veil of clouds. A hush spread across the land, a hush shaped by exhaustion, fear, and the uncertain knowledge that what had begun as a search for answers had become something much heavier. And somewhere in that gathering dark, far from the clearing, far from the voices that shaped her fate, a plank in the old cabin wall creaked, a slow, bending sound that could have been the cold settling into wood, or something else entirely. It is with that quiet, searching creak that the next part of the story begins. The creak of the plank faded into the stillness of the small cabin, swallowed by the thick quiet that hung over the valley like a heavy quilt. The woman sat on the rough-hewn bench where her escorts had left her, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the faint glow of the lantern throwing soft shadows along the worn floorboards. She could hear only her own breathing and the occasional pop from the lantern's wick. In that moment, she felt the weight of the valley's fear pressing against the door, a force as real as any sickness or winter storm. For the first time since her husband's death, she sensed she might not survive the days ahead, not because of illness or starvation, but because a community she had lived among, worked beside, and cared for had turned its collective gaze against her. Outside, the night deepened. Frost gathered on the grass and crept along the cabin's corners. By morning, the valley would wake to another cold day, another round of chores, another string of quiet conversations winding themselves around the outcome of the gathering. The people who had escorted her back did not speak much on their way home. Each man carried his own burden of doubt or conviction, but none dared question aloud what they had agreed to. In small, isolated communities, doubt can be mistaken for betrayal, and betrayal can quickly become its own kind of danger. So they walked silently beneath the bare branches, lanterns bobbing along the path like drifting fireflies, leaving behind the woman whose future now hung suspended in the long shadow of fear. By dawn, word of her confinement had spread across the ridge. News travels through rural valleys not by speed but by resonance. passing from neighbor to neighbor with small additions or omissions, shaped subtly by the teller's tone. Some said she had been taken gently to the cabin. Others claimed she had fought the men, though no such struggle had occurred. Some insisted she had cursed them under her breath, even though she had spoken only once during the walk, asking quietly if she might bring her Bible. The details blurred, but the core remained the same. The valley had taken action, and action, even uncertain, gave people a sense of control in the face of sickness and grief. Families gathered in their living rooms and kitchens, discussing what might come next. Mothers spoke low, mindful of curious children. Fathers weighed the risks of releasing her too soon or keeping her too long. Even those who had not attended the gathering felt compelled to take a position, though few dared express anything less than cautious agreement with the community's choice. In a time when survival depended on unity, dissent could feel like an act of self-endangerment. A few neighbors, particularly those living closer to the ridge, felt unease at the thought of the woman alone in the cabin. They remembered moments of kindness she had shown, a basket of vegetables left at a doorstep during a lean year, a remedy shared during a cough-filled winter, a night she helped steady a frightened child while his father fetched the doctor from a distant town. These memories stirred discomfort in those who valued fairness, but fairness itself felt like a luxury in a valley where misfortune had piled upon misfortune. Illness had taken lives, livestock had fallen dead in pastures, and the fear of unseen forces pressed against cabin walls like a relentless wind. On the second day of her confinement, 2 men were assigned to bring her food and water. They approached the small cabin with stiff posture, each uncertain how to greet her. When they opened the door, the lantern glow spilled across her figure, seated quietly near the hearth. She did not rise or shrink away. Instead, she met their eyes with a quiet resolve that unsettled them more than any resistance might have. They placed the food near the door and left quickly, murmuring brief instructions that sounded almost rehearsed. Neither man wished to linger. Later, each confessed privately that her stillness had unnerved him, though neither could explain why. As the days passed, the valley waited for signs. Families watched their livestock closely. Parents felt the foreheads of their children with anxious regularity. Every cough, every chill, every strange noise in the woods took on significance. Some believed that if the woman truly were responsible for the sickness, the illness would weaken in her absence. Others feared it might worsen if she had been wrongly accused. The valley existed in this tense balance, waiting for proof that could not come. It was around this time that one of the oldest residents, a woman who had lived through more winters than many could count, began telling stories of past accusations she had witnessed decades earlier in another settlement. She spoke of how fear could twist a person's memory, how suspicion could become truth simply because enough mouths repeated it. Her recollections drifted through the valley like an unwelcome wind. Some listened with unease, wondering whether the community had acted too hastily. Others dismissed her accounts as the ramblings of someone too old to understand the urgency of their situation. Her words planted seeds of doubt in only a few hearts, and doubt, outnumbered, struggles to grow. The valley's ministers were divided as well. A traveling preacher who happened to be in the area cautioned restraint, reminding families that suffering did not always spring from human cause. He urged compassion, prayer, and patience, but his voice carried little weight against the steady fear of those who believed action had been necessary. Another minister, more firmly rooted in the valley's traditions, spoke of the dangers of spiritual corruption. He warned that evil could wear familiar faces, and that sometimes harsh measures were needed to protect the innocent. His sermons resonated deeply with those who had lost children, livestock, or hope. These conflicting voices swirled around the settlement, shaping the valley's mood. Some nights felt almost peaceful, as though the land were holding its breath. Other nights carried strange sounds, branches snapping, distant cries, the restless calls of animals unsettled by winter hunger. In such an atmosphere, every noise became a sign, every dream an omen. The woman in the cabin remained quiet. On the third day, her escorts found her staring through the small window at the frost-covered fields, her face a mixture of sorrow and resignation. She asked again for her Bible, and this time they allowed her to have it. She held it gently as though it were the last familiar thing left to her. She spoke only once, asking the men if the sickness had eased. They exchanged glances, uncertain how to answer. One finally muttered that it was too early to know. She nodded slowly, as if expecting that response. Outside the cabin, rumors continued to circulate. Someone claimed the livestock deaths had slowed. Another insisted they had increased. Stories conflicted, but they all led to the same conclusion. The valley needed a permanent answer. People could not endure such tension indefinitely. A decision would have to be made, one that would either free her or condemn her. And the longer she remained confined, the more people leaned toward condemnation. Fear grows in silence, and the cabin's stillness fed the valley's imagination. Then, on the fourth night, something happened that would shift the valley's uncertainty into a more decisive form. A small cluster of cattle belonging to a family near the creek fell ill suddenly, staggering and foaming at the mouth before collapsing. The timing, though coincidental, struck the valley like a blow. Word spread by dawn, and the story grew with each telling. Some said all the cattle had died. Others said the animals had cried like people. None of this was true, but truth had lost its footing days before. By sunrise, a crowd had formed at Latham's property. They spoke in urgent voices, their breath rising in pale clouds. This new misfortune, so soon after the woman's confinement, convinced many that merely separating her from the valley had not been enough. Something more decisive, more final would be required. The valley's decision began taking form before anyone spoke it aloud. The woman's fate must be sealed. The community would meet again at dusk to decide. As the sun dipped low behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the frost-laden earth, a single lantern burned in the window of the cabin where the woman waited, its glow small, flickering, fragile. And it is into the gathering dark, with that lantern trembling against the cold, that the next part of the story enters. The lantern burned low in the cabin window, its flame trembling every time the wind brushed past the thin glass. From a distance, the small glow looked almost like a final plea, fragile, wavering, vulnerable, against the vast quiet descending over the valley. As dusk thickened, families gathered once more at Latham's place, moving through the cold like a procession bound by duty rather than desire. No one walked quickly. No one spoke loudly. Fear, exhaustion, and the heavy knowledge that a decision now rested upon them clung to every set of shoulders. The sickness, the livestock deaths, the long nights of uncertainty, all had pushed them toward this moment. But as they approached the barn, lanterns in hand, many felt a weight in their hearts that no one dared name aloud. A community can march toward decisive action, yet each individual can tremble beneath the surface. Inside the barn, lanterns were hung from nails hammered into beams years earlier for harvest gatherings and winter repairs. Tonight, those same lights cast long, thin shadows across the walls. People stood close together for warmth, but their closeness held no comfort. Children were left outside with older siblings. The matters at hand were deemed too dark for young ears. Mothers and fathers exchanged tense glances, knowing that whatever they decided would shape their children's understanding of justice for the rest of their lives. The barn filled slowly until nearly every family on the ridge was present. The air hummed with low prayers, anxious muttering, and the faint creak of wood shifting under weight. Latham stood near the front, his hands clasped tightly. His face bore the deep fatigue of a man who had worked hard and grieved harder. Everyone knew the burden he carried. They saw it each time he glanced down, as if searching for a way to soften his resolve. But grief sharpens even the gentlest hearts. When the murmur finally quieted, it was he who lifted his voice first, though it caught in his throat before the words found their way out. He spoke of the sickness, how it lingered stubbornly despite prayers and herbal remedies. He spoke of the livestock deaths, the strange behavior of animals, and the unexplainable patterns that had made so many uneasy for so long. He reminded them of their earlier gathering, the testimonies they had heard, the wind that had swept through the clearing, the crow whose cry had pierced their fears. He wove these details together, not with malice, but with sorrow, as though laying out a story none wished to believe, yet felt compelled to acknowledge. His voice trembled as he finished, and for a moment he simply stood there, his eyes closed, as though praying someone else might take this burden from him. But another voice rose, Huxley's, stronger and more tormented. His wife had grown worse. Fever burned through her nights, and whispers of delirium haunted his home. He spoke with the desperation of a man losing the person he loved most. In his grief, the valley heard echoes of its own suffering. Fear has a way of finding the strongest voice to ride upon. And tonight, grief and fear shared the same breath. Huxley insisted that the valley could no longer endure the uncertainty. He believed, deeply, painfully, that the woman on the ridge had brought the sickness upon them, whether through intention or unknowingly. His words shook free some final restraint in the room. Even those who doubted her guilt felt the pull of wanting a single explanation for their pain. Other voices followed, some cautious, some firm. A few suggested exile, sending her away from the valley, perhaps to stay with distant kin or travel to another settlement. But others argued that exile might not break whatever influence she held. And beneath these arguments simmered a deeper truth, one few dared say aloud. Sending her away would not remove the fear now rooted in the valley. Fear, once rooted, demands closure. It demands certainty. And the valley, weary and grieving, craved certainty more than anything else. As the voices rose and fell, weaving through grief, anger, doubt, and superstition, the woman in the small cabin sat alone with her Bible open on her lap. She traced the familiar lines with her fingers, whispering prayers for forgiveness, protection, and understanding. She did not pray for vindication. Somehow she sensed that her fate no longer rested in truth. Outside, frost continued to spread across the grass, inching up the cabin walls like a thin, pale vine. Her lantern flickered. Her breath trembled. But her prayers remained steady, even as fear pressed itself firmly against the thin wooden door. Back in the barn, a final voice spoke, the old woman who had tried, days earlier, to temper the valley's judgment. Her steps were slow, her breath shallow. She lifted her hand and asked for silence. The room obliged. She told them stories of past accusations in other valleys, how good people had been blamed for tragedies they had no hand in. She warned them of the danger in acting out of fear. She reminded them that once a person's fate was sealed by rumor, no amount of regret could undo the harm. The room listened, quiet and respectful, but her wisdom, though genuine, felt fragile against days of accumulating terror. People heard her words, but they clung to their fear. When she finished, silence fell heavy. It sat on the beams, on the hay dust, on the bowed heads of neighbors torn between conscience and dread. And then, with a kind of exhausted inevitability, the decision formed, not from any single voice, but from the slow, collective weight of the valley's fear. They would take her from the cabin at first light. They would hold one final questioning. And if no evidence of innocence appeared, they would impose whatever judgment the valley deemed necessary to protect itself. No formal vote was cast, no hand was raised, but those present felt the decision settle around them like a tightening ring. The meeting ended slowly, people drifting away in silence, lanterns bobbing through the darkness like ghostly fire drifting across the cold land. As the crowd dispersed, one man lingered at the barn's entrance, staring toward the ridge where the woman's lantern still flickered faintly. He felt a heaviness in his chest, something that whispered caution, but he said nothing. The weight of the valley's fear pressed too heavily upon him, and he, like many others, walked away, knowing that dawn would bring a choice no one could escape. Night deepened around the ridge. The frost thickened. Owls called from the woods, their cries echoing like soft laments. The woman in the cabin felt these sounds settle around her like warnings. She closed her Bible, folded her hands, and whispered one final prayer into the cold air, her voice thin, fragile, but resolute. A single lantern glowed in her window, flickering as the wind pressed harder against the valley. And far off, somewhere between the barn and the cabin, a dog began to howl. A long, slow, mournful sound that stretched across the dark like a lament for something already lost. It is with that lonely, lingering howl that the next part of the story takes its first breath. The dog's howl drifted across the valley for a long, unbroken moment, the sort of sound that seems to tremble in the very ribs of the land. It cut through the night like a lament, or a warning, or perhaps merely the instinctive cry of an animal sensing the unease woven through every homestead. Inside the small cabin, the woman lifted her head at the sound, her breath catching faintly. She recognized the tone, a mourning howl, the kind dogs release when storms shift or when death leans closer to a house than comfort allows. She listened until the cry faded into the cold darkness, replaced by the hollow quiet that had wrapped itself around the ridge since her confinement. In that quiet, she prayed with renewed intensity, not for rescue, but for clarity, for the valley to see beyond its fear. Dawn rose slowly the next morning, a pale and muted light that seemed reluctant to spread across the frost-stiffened earth. Thin ribbons of mist drifted above the creek, and the air carried the metallic bite of deep winter. In another season, on another day, such a dawn might have been peaceful, but as the valley awakened, a subdued tension pulsed beneath each cabin's roof. People moved quietly through their chores, their voices lowered even within their own homes, as though speaking too loudly might stir something that had been uneasy enough already. Word had spread through whispers, through nods exchanged at fences, through the lingering glances of neighbors who did not want to speak what they knew. The valley would gather again before midday. The woman would be questioned one final time. And the community, its doubts and fears now thick enough to shape into decision, would settle her fate. No one felt ready, yet everyone felt compelled. The cabin where she waited stood at the valley's lower end, its small shape outlined against a backdrop of bare trees. The frost on its roof shimmered faintly as the weak sunlight touched it, and a thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney, proof that she had managed to keep her fire alive through the night. When the men approached, their boots crunching quietly across the hardened ground, they found her sitting near the hearth with her Bible open. She rose calmly when they entered, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes carrying a mixture of fatigue and acceptance. They told her the community was waiting. She nodded. There were no questions left to ask, no arguments she had not already made. The walk to the gathering place felt longer than any of them expected. The men did not bind her hands. They did not need to. She walked between them with the silent dignity of someone who had surrendered to the gravity of her circumstances. Her breath formed pale clouds in the morning air. She avoided looking at the windows they passed, where curtains or blankets shifted faintly as neighbors peeked out. Some faces held sorrow, some fear, some a blank, guarded stillness. Those who watched knew the weight of what was to come, even if they told themselves they were acting out of necessity. When they reached Latham's property, a crowd had already formed. The barn doors stood open, lanterns dim against the growing daylight. People gathered in a wide semicircle, men to the front, women and older children behind them. Some stood with arms crossed, others with hands shaking slightly inside coat pockets. The air hummed with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. No one wanted to be the first to speak. No one wanted to admit the valley had reached a point where a woman's fate would be decided by fear rather than fact. Yet everyone sensed the momentum that had carried them here. Slow, inexorable, almost impossible to halt now. The woman stepped into the center of the clearing, her breath steady, her eyes lowered briefly before rising to look at the neighbors she had known for so many years. A few could not meet her gaze. Others held it, though their expressions were already shaped by grief or hardened by fear. Huxley stood near the front, his wife's illness etched deeply into the lines of his face. Latham stood beside him, his jaw clenched, his eyes shadowed. The old woman who had spoken against judgment earlier sat on a nearby stump, her face pale but alert. The questioning began slowly, almost cautiously. Someone asked whether she had dreamed anything unusual during her confinement. She answered calmly, explaining that her nights had been restless but uneventful. Another asked whether she had seen strange lights near her cabin. She shook her head. A man in the back asked if she had spoken to anyone unseen. Her eyes widened faintly with hurt at the implication, but she answered softly, no. Each answer was simple, steady, clear. But the valley no longer measured truth by clarity. It measured truth by the shape of its fear. Huxley stepped forward. His voice trembled with grief, yet carried the force of someone desperate for resolution. He asked whether she had ever wished harm upon his household or upon anyone else in the valley. She answered with a firm shake of her head, her voice steady as she said she had prayed for his wife often. But Huxley heard only the echo of his wife's whispered fever dreams, the name she had murmured in her delirium. That memory now stood heavier in his heart than any denial. Then came the question that carried the most weight, though it was asked in a whisper, almost reluctantly. Will you swear before God and this community that you have brought no harm to us? The question hung in the cold air like a suspended breath. The woman lowered her eyes, not in guilt, but in something close to anguish. To swear such a thing felt like placing her entire faith before a crowd already convinced they knew the truth. She whispered that she had harmed no one, but when asked again to swear, loudly, clearly, formally, she hesitated, only for a moment, but a moment was enough. A rustle passed through the crowd, like wind moving across a field of dry leaves. Suspicion tightened around her again, as if the hesitation had revealed everything they feared. The old woman on the stump rose slowly, leaning on her walking stick. She urged the crowd to remember that hesitation does not equal guilt. She reminded them that fear could distort even the purest intentions. Her voice carried the clarity of someone who had lived long enough to witness fear's consequences. But fear does not reason with wisdom. It reasons with patterns and emotion and the quiet stories people tell themselves at night. A young man, one who had spoken earlier of seeing shadows near her home, now shouted that hesitation was the sign they had been waiting for. Others murmured agreement. A few cried that they could no longer risk waiting for more sickness. Someone near the back whispered that the livestock deaths were surely her doing. Voices rose. The tide shifted. A few voices tried to calm the crowd, but calmness had lost its footing long before dawn broke over the ridge. Latham raised his hand. The clearing fell gradually into silence. His face looked older than it had days earlier, as though each hour of fear had carved new lines across his skin. His voice, when it came, was low and heavy. He said the valley must choose. If they released her and sickness continued, they would never forgive themselves. If they condemned her and were wrong, the valley would bear a scar no prayer could wash away. Yet the valley, he said, could not remain suspended between fear and uncertainty. He paused for a long moment. The valley held its breath. Then, slowly, heavily, he spoke the words that would settle into the bones of the Ozarks for generations. The woman must leave the valley permanently, tonight, and she must not return. It was exile, not death, not punishment under law, not violence. To many, it felt like the only path that allowed mercy and safety to coexist. To others, it felt like the valley was merely pushing its fear into the woods, letting uncertainty roam outside their borders. Yet the decision, once spoken aloud, took root quickly. Exile offered resolution without blood. It offered protection without the darkest form of judgment. The woman closed her eyes as the decision washed over her, relief mixed with sorrow. The valley she had called home was casting her out, but it was granting her life. She whispered a quiet blessing. "Forgive them, they do not know what harm fear can do," and then waited to be escorted back to the cabin to gather her few belongings. As she was led away, the valley exhaled, a long, uneven breath. Some felt lighter, some felt sick, some wondered if they had just witnessed wisdom or cowardice. The old woman on the stump lowered her head and murmured a prayer no one else could hear. When the woman reached the cabin, the lantern still flickered in the window, its small flame trembling. She stepped inside, gathered her Bible, a shawl, a bundle of herbs, and a small wooden carving her husband had made long ago. Outside, twilight crept over the ridge. The sky faded to a deepening blue. A cold wind stirred the branches, and from the far side of the valley came a faint, distant sound, something between a cry and a call, rising as though the land itself felt the shift of what had been decided. It is with that distant, uncertain sound that the next part of the story begins. The faint, distant sound that rose across the valley lingered long after the woman finished gathering her belongings. It wavered in the evening air like a wandering spirit, unsure of its message, too soft to identify, too sharp to ignore. The men who stood outside the cabin stiffened as they heard it, their lanterns casting unsteady patches of light across the frost-laced ground. One man murmured that it might be an animal cry, perhaps a fox or a nightbird stirred too early. Another man shook his head, saying nothing, for he knew the sound did not rest easily in the familiar categories of the woods. Yet none of them dared connect it to the woman they were exiling. Fear permits imagination, but it rarely allows confession. Inside the cabin, the woman paused, shawl draped across her shoulders, as the sound drifted through the thin walls. She closed her eyes. It was neither a cry she recognized nor one she feared. It simply felt like another piece of the valley she was being forced to leave behind. When she opened her eyes again, the room around her seemed strangely still, as though even the fire hesitated to move. Her Bible rested in her hands. Her bundle of herbs hung from her arm. A single tear traced a quiet path down her cheek, not for herself, but for the valley she knew had lost its way. When she stepped outside, the cold struck her sharply. Her escort, unsure whether to speak, simply motioned toward the path. She walked without resistance, her footsteps crunching softly across frost. Each step echoed faintly, swallowed quickly by the gathering dark. Neighbors who watched from windows felt an ache at the sight, though few would admit it. Fear had done its work. And now, in the soft twilight, the valley prepared to finalize the act that would live in whispers for generations. But the story of Alpena's witch trial, if one dares to call it that, does not exist in isolation. It belongs to a larger tapestry woven across the American frontier, in hollows, settlements, and ridges, where faith, fear, and folklore intertwined. To understand what happened in this valley, one must step back from the narrow ridge where the woman walked into exile and look outward to the broader patterns of belief that shaped communities throughout the early Ozarks and beyond. Long before settlers arrived in what would become the Ozarks, the idea of witches traveled through European memory. Those memories carried across oceans in the minds of families fleeing hardship, persecution, or simple hunger. They settled in Appalachia first, where isolation and rugged land gave old beliefs fertile soil. They drifted westward with the Cherokee and Shawnee trails, carried in stories whispered around fires. They mingled with the German hex traditions brought by Pennsylvania Dutch families, beliefs and charms, counterspells, and symbols carved into barns to ward off evil. And when these groups eventually carved homesteads in the Ozarks, they carried their fears with them just as surely as they carried their Bibles, their seeds, and their tools. Witch belief in the Ozarks was rarely dramatic. It lacked the court transcripts and hysteria of Salem. It unfolded instead in quiet conversations, in troubled dreams, in the subtle ways people interpreted misfortune. A cow's sudden illness, a baby's fever, a well running dry. These events were not isolated occurrences. In isolated regions, misfortune accumulates meaning, and meaning becomes story. Stories drift from cabin to cabin until they settle into the identity of a place. Throughout the 19th century, tales of witches, though rarely recorded in newspapers, circulated widely through rural communities. Some were cautionary, warning children not to wander far from home. Others served as explanations for suffering in an era without dependable doctors or scientific understanding. Many were not stories of witches at all, but stories of healers, people, usually women, whose knowledge of herbs and remedies exceeded what their neighbors understood. The boundary between healer and witch was perilously thin, and when sickness struck, that line became nearly invisible. The woman exiled from the valley fit a familiar pattern. Across the Ozarks, those branded with suspicion often shared certain traits. They lived on the edge of settlements. They kept to themselves. They possessed knowledge others found strange or unsettling. They had experienced sorrow that set them apart. The valley had not invented its fear of her. It had inherited it. Each family carried stories of uncanny experiences, of cows souring milk, of charms failing, of eerie nighttime sounds. These memories, once small, grew larger in the presence of illness. And once illness began to shape belief, the valley's course was nearly set. The broader American frontier had its own echoes of such trials, though most were never written down. In Tennessee, legends told of a witch blamed for a family's failing farm. In Kentucky, a healer was once driven out after a season of unexplained deaths. In Missouri, not far from the Ozarks, stories circulated of a woman accused of soot blackening her neighbor's milk pail with curses, an occurrence later attributed to mold. These tales rarely ended in violence, but often ended in exile, shunning, or lifelong suspicion. Frontier justice was shaped less by law and more by necessity, and necessity often followed the path carved by fear. Folklorists who studied the region generations later found striking similarities between these stories. An unexplained event, a growing unease, a figure who stood at the margins of the community, and a gathering where people shared testimonies shaped by grief rather than evidence. The details differed, but the structure remained. Human fear, passed through time, repeats itself in familiar patterns. And yet, for all the commonality, each valley's story carried its own local flavor. In the Ozarks, the land itself played a role. The deep hollows, dense forests, and twisting rivers created an environment where echoes carried strangely and shadows stretched long. Stories grew out of this landscape the way mushrooms grow after rain, suddenly, quietly, irresistibly. Even the animals contributed to the region's folklore. The calls of owls, foxes, and panthers, piercing, strange, seemingly human at times, intertwined with local belief. The very air seemed to hum with possibility. It was in this context that the valley made its choice, one shaped by inherited fears, recent grief, and the isolation of frontier life. The woman's exile was not the beginning of the story, nor was it the end. It was a moment suspended between centuries of superstition and the slow approach of a more rational age. As evening deepened and her solitary figure continued toward the edge of the valley, the land held its breath. Some families watched her pass between the trees, their lanterns dimmed so she would not see them. Others closed their shutters, unwilling to witness the conclusion of a story they had helped shape. Children whispered questions behind quilts, wondering where she would go. No one had answers. Beyond the valley, the hills opened into a quiet, winding world where ridges folded into ridges. The path she followed led into an area known for old logging trails and half-collapsed cabins abandoned decades earlier. She walked slowly, her breath catching in the cold. At the crest of a small rise, she paused, turning once to look back at the place she had called home. Lanterns flickered faintly in the distance. No one saw her raise her hand, whether in farewell, blessing, or simple instinct. But some later claimed the wind changed direction at that instant, sweeping down the ridge with a low, throaty murmur. The valley, meanwhile, settled into an unsettling quiet. And it is into that quiet, deep, uncertain, and stretching across the hills, that the next part of the story unfolds. The valley settled into that quiet as though winter itself had closed a heavy door. For a time, the silence felt like relief. Families rose the morning after the exile, believing, or wanting to believe, that the worst had passed. The woman was gone. The ridge no longer held her presence at its edge, and with her departure, many hoped the sickness would loosen its grip on their homes. But quiet can be misleading. It can mask what stirs beneath the surface, what shifts unnoticed in the hollows and along the creek beds. It can also hide the ache of doubt that grows in the minds of those who acted out of fear rather than certainty. The following days unfolded slowly. Some families swore they felt lighter. A child who had been ill woke with a small appetite. A cow that had refused to stand managed to rise again. These small improvements bolstered the valley's conviction that they had done the right thing. People murmured prayers of gratitude. The ministers spoke of deliverance. Men who had argued for action now walked with more confidence, believing their choice had aligned with God's will. Yet for every family who felt relief, another remained troubled. Some saw no change in their fortunes. A sick child did not improve. Another animal died inexplicably, a well soured. The valley became a patchwork of hope and unease, as though the land itself had not agreed to follow a single direction. But the exile itself began weaving a different kind of story, one not carried by illness, but by memory. Stories of what had happened at the gathering spread quickly, but as they traveled, they bent and stretched and curled like smoke. People retold the woman's hesitation in various lights. Some said she had stood with unnatural calm. Others said she had trembled so violently her shawl had shaken. A few claimed her eyes had glowed oddly in the lantern light, though no lantern truly casts such glow except through imagination. What had been a complicated, heavy human moment now began shaping itself into legend, one embellished detail at a time. Children hearing partial stories through the gaps of adult conversations stitched together their own versions. They whispered that she had walked without leaving footprints in the frost. They told one another that the wind had circled her when she left, that it had whispered in a language only she could understand. In time, these child-shaped rumors would harden into lore, repeated as fact long after the true story faded. A valley remembers what it wants to remember and forgets what causes too much discomfort. Even elders who had once defended her found themselves speaking of her with a cautious tone. They said she had always been different, though they once found that difference harmless. They noted how she had lived quietly, how she had walked the woods alone. None of these qualities had troubled them before the sickness, but fear rewrites memory. In such rewriting, a woman becomes a symbol, a vessel for the valley's anxieties, a scapegoat for the pain they could not control. The exile allowed them to reshape her story without her voice to correct it. Meanwhile, in the wider Ozarks and beyond, histories of similar accusations whispered through communities long after the events themselves. People spoke of women touched by the uncanny, of men who had angered the wrong spirit, of mysterious forces blamed for storms, plagues, or sudden deaths. These tales became part of a larger fabric of American frontier belief, woven out of fear, necessity, and inherited folklore. In places where isolation carved deep lines between communities, people leaned on the stories that helped them understand their suffering. And so a local event, small by any broader measure, gained the weight of myth simply because it fit so neatly into the patterns people already believed. The Ozarks in particular held tightly to their stories. The hills kept them, the hollows echoed them, and generations passed them down like heirlooms. In some accounts, the Witch of Alpena became a cautionary figure, a reminder that danger sometimes wears familiar faces. In others, she became a symbol of wronged innocence, a woman cast out by fear and ignorance. Both versions carried pieces of the truth, but neither captured it entirely. The real story was more human, more tangled, more painful. Families who had lived nearest her ridge felt the story deepen most sharply. They recalled moments when she had offered them herbs or remedies, and they wondered whether rejecting her had been cruel. But such reflections were rarely spoken aloud. To question the valley's actions openly felt risky, as though it might reopen the door to fear. And so they carried these doubts quietly, allowing their silence to become part of the valley's unspoken history. In time, strangers passing through the region heard fragments of the story. Travelers who stopped at local taverns or trading posts listened as locals recounted the events with a mixture of pride and regret. Pride because the valley had taken action to protect its own. Regret because some wondered whether they had misjudged her. These conflicting emotions often colored the telling, giving it the quality of a tale that could not quite settle on a single truth. This uncertainty is one of the reasons the Alpena witch trial never reached the pages of regional newspapers in any definitive form. Instead, it lived on through oral tradition, shaped, reshaped, and softened or sharpened, depending on who told it. Historians, years later, piecing together scattered references, found records thin and often contradictory. A family journal might speak of a strange sickness, but never mention a woman. Another account might refer to troubles on the ridge, without explaining what they were. A letter might hint at community tensions, but avoid naming names. Folklorists collecting stories from elders found much more. Tales of accusations, of fearful gatherings, of whispering winds and moonlit exile. But these stories rarely aligned cleanly. Some versions exaggerated events, others downplayed them, and still others cast the woman as a healer rather than a threat. Such contradictions are the hallmark of folklore. Where history seeks precision, folklore seeks meaning. It remembers emotions more clearly than facts. It amplifies the parts that resonate and lets the rest fade. And in the Ozarks, where families lived for generations in the same hollows, stories often carried more weight than written records. The truth of what happened became entangled with what people feared might have happened. In later decades, as the valley settled into a new era, shaped by railroads, more frequent trade, and shifting communities, the story of the witch trial faded from immediate memory, but remained present in the undercurrent of local belief. Parents told their children not to wander near the old ridge at dusk. Hunters avoided certain paths. Folks collecting herbs in the woods sometimes muttered prayers or carried small charms just in case. None said the woman's name, but everyone remembered her presence in their own way. Some insisted the valley had been right to act. Others believed they had been wrong, and still others claimed the truth lay somewhere in between, that the valley had been frightened, that the sickness had been real, and that the woman had become the vessel for fears too large to name. But one question lingered through the years, haunting the edges of every retelling. Did the valley condemn an innocent woman, or did the land itself sense something the people could not fully explain? As the decades passed, the details blurred further. The story became part of the region's long memory, a mixture of caution, sorrow, and mystery. And as with all stories carried through time, the truth remained just beyond reach, half shadowed by the fog of recollection. It is within this fog, thick, shifting, and filled with unanswered questions, that the next part of the story opens. The fog of recollection that settled over the witch trial of Alpena did not lift quickly. It stretched across years, then decades, softening the sharp edges of memory until the event existed half in truth and half in the realm of shadow. In the years immediately following the woman's exile, the valley underwent a slow transformation. Not dramatic, not sudden, but steady, like the gradual wearing down of stone by wind. Families continued to farm, to bury their dead, to raise their children, yet something unspoken lingered beneath the surface of daily life. A subtle wariness, a discomfort around unanswered questions, a hush that fell whenever the ridge was mentioned. If the valley had hoped that removing the woman would bring peace, it found instead a hollow quiet, one that pressed itself into winter nights and lingered in the corners of every gathering. The sickness that had haunted the region did not end overnight. Some households improved, while others suffered new waves of fever or unexplained ailments. Livestock continued to die now and then, though less abruptly. These inconsistencies made it difficult to claim with any certainty that the valley's decision had worked. Yet the valley rarely spoke of these contradictions. People have a way of shaping memories to protect themselves. To admit the exile might not have changed the valley's fortunes meant admitting they had cast out one of their own for nothing. And so, without ever declaring it, the community began to shift its focus away from the sickness itself and toward the story they had created around it. The woman, meanwhile, vanished into the folds of the Ozark wilderness. Some said she moved east, seeking distant relatives. Others believed she died within weeks, overwhelmed by cold or hunger. A few insisted she had been seen years later in a town across the state line, working as a midwife. No account was ever verified. What remained was the echo of her absence, which weighed more heavily on the valley than any physical presence ever could have. Her cabin fell into disrepair, its roof sagging, its garden overtaken by weeds. Children were warned not to wander near it. Hunters avoided the area. Over time, the land reclaimed the small structure, leaving only a faint outline where the walls had once stood. The void she left behind allowed stories to grow freely. In the years after her exile, people continued to reinterpret the events through the lens of their own emotions. Those who had been terrified now remembered the signs of danger as clearer than they ever had. Those who had hesitated now softened their memories of doubt. A few who had remained silent during the gathering began insisting they had opposed the exile, though no one could recall their voices in the moment. The human mind reshapes the past to make peace with itself. And yet, beneath all this reshaping, the deeper truth remained untouched. The valley had acted out of fear. The sickness had overwhelmed them. Their losses had clouded their judgment. They had turned to the oldest explanation available to them, seeking certainty in the face of chaos. But certainty built on fear is rarely steady. And so the valley carried its decision like a stone tucked into a pocket, always there, always weighing against the heart, even when no one spoke of it. As the decades passed, change swept through the region. The Civil War scarred the Ozarks, leaving families divided, homes burned, and communities shattered. After the war, the railroad came through, carving a new path across the hills and giving birth to the town that would eventually take the name Alpena. Along with the railroad came new families, new ideas, and a gradual softening of old superstitions. Younger generations grew up hearing fragments of the witch trial story, but felt detached from its emotions. The event began slipping into the realm of folklore rather than history, and as folklore, it gained a different kind of power, less immediate, but more enduring. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the story had settled into a familiar rhythm. Elders told it in dim kitchens during winter storms. Hunters shared versions of it while cleaning game after dusk. Children dared one another to walk near the ridge where the woman's cabin had once stood. Some versions of the tale painted her as a malevolent figure who had cursed the valley until the people found the courage to banish her. Other versions softened her into a misunderstood healer, a woman who carried knowledge beyond her time and was punished for it. And some stories held both truths at once, the duality that often shapes the most persistent folklore. The town of Alpena itself came to bear the quiet imprint of the story. Though no monument or marker acknowledged it, the memory lingered in the way older residents lowered their voices when the subject surfaced. It lived in the nervous glance toward the ridge during certain seasons, in the uneasy flutter that passed through the crowd whenever a new sickness swept through. Fear has a long echo in isolated regions, and the Ozarks remember through stories as much as through written record. Even as the 20th century brought more education, more medical knowledge, and more connection to the outside world, the legend of the Alpena witch trial persisted. Scholars who visited the region in later decades collected fragments of the story from elderly residents. Some accounts were gentle, emphasizing regret. Others leaned into the supernatural, describing dark shadows, unsettling winds, or strange lights on the night of her exile. The details varied wildly, but all pointed back to a single shared memory. The valley had made a choice out of fear, and fear had shaped the story ever since. The question that lingered beneath every retelling was simple, yet impossibly complex. What truly happened? In the absence of clear records, the truth dissolved into the mist of generational storytelling. But perhaps the question itself revealed a deeper truth. The trial had not simply been an event. It had become a mirror for the valley's own relationship with fear, isolation, and suffering. The Ozarks, like many rural regions, has long stood at the intersection of faith and folklore. The land carries both comfort and mystery. It holds the warmth of community, but also the quiet whispers of superstition. The Alpena trial lived at the heart of this intersection. It revealed how people seek meaning when tragedy strikes, how suspicion can take root in soil made fertile by grief, and how communities sometimes search for a tangible cause for intangible suffering. In this way, the woman's story became larger than her life. It became a reflection of the valley itself, its strength, its vulnerability, its desire for certainty, and its struggle against the unknown. Her exile symbolized the Ozarks' long tension between seeking truth and fearing mystery. Over time, as storytellers passed along the tale, they infused it with lessons. Some warned against the dangers of isolation. Others emphasized the importance of compassion. Still others used it to remind listeners that fear, once given form, can lead even good people to frightening conclusions. The story became a way to explore the fragile line between faith and superstition, justice and vengeance, truth and legend. And so the trial of Alpena, never written in official records, never emblazoned in newspapers, remained alive because it held a seed of truth recognizable across generations. When people are frightened, they search for answers. When answers hide, they search for someone to blame. And when blame lands on the wrong person, the consequences ripple outward for years. No one in Alpena speaks of the woman directly anymore. Her name, if it ever lived clearly in the valley's memory, has long since dissolved into silence. But the ridge where she once lived still carries a certain hush in the late hours. Hunters passing through sometimes pause, feeling an inexplicable sense of watching. Children, even now, whisper that the trees grow unusually twisted near the old cabin site. Whether any of this is true matters less than the fact that the valley believes these things. Belief shapes place, belief shapes memory, and memory shapes how a community understands itself. As the story approaches its quiet close, the Valley of Alpena stands not as a backdrop to a single event, but as a witness to the way fear can shape a narrative long after facts fade. And the hills, older than any settlement, hold the story quietly, never confirming, never denying, simply keeping watch as they always have. And it is in that watchful stillness, in the hills that remember, in the silence shaped by generations, that the final part of this story prepares to unfold.